10, 9, ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
Welcome to part 7 of our video series highlighting the 1/100th scale Saturn V kit from Estes. In this video, we'll be prepping and installing the fins and fin fairings. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Saturn V booster are these flared fin fairings, which give the rocket a truly unique look that make it immediately recognizable. Here's what we'll need for this part of our project. First, we'll need the fin halves. We'll need the vacuum-formed fin fairing parts. And we'll also need this laser cut fin base set and fin alignment guide. We'll start by putting together the injection molded fin halves sets. These are really well molded. All they'll need is just a little bit of liquid cement around the edges. Just a little bit on the interior surfaces, and then add the other side. A little bit of pressure. Let's free the parts from the laser cut sheet. We can also go ahead and free our alignment guide. We'll use a pair of scissors to cut these into more manageable bits. Let's test fit one of these crescent-shaped fin fairing stiffeners into the base of a fin fairing. Now the kit instructions would have us glue that in place using tube-type plastic model cement. I would rather not do that, and it has to do with how plastic model cements work, both tube type and the liquid type. Those adhesives work by literally melting plastic. That works great if you're gluing a plastic part to another plastic part. In this case, we have a cardstock part going into a plastic part. I don't want this outside surface to be distorted at all. Instead, I'd rather use 5-minute epoxy. The reason is that epoxies are great for gluing dissimilar materials together. I'll begin by roughing up the interior surface of the fin fairing with a sanding stick. We'll mix up some 5-minute epoxy. I'm going to mix that up with a Q-tip. A rubber glove magically appeared on my hand. We'll use the Q-tip to apply the epoxy to the interior of the fin fairing part. And then the fin fairing stiffener can go into place. Put some pressure on it. Make sure that it's fully in place. And I'll hold that for a couple of moments. A few minutes later, and the epoxy has set up. We'll repeat that 3 more times. The next thing we should do is go back to our fins and clean up these seam lines a little bit with our sanding sticks. I'm starting with medium, going to fine, and then finishing with extra fine. Looks great. We'll do that 3 more times. The epoxy on the inside of our fin fairing assembly is cured, so we can go ahead and mark and cut this particular part. We'll be using a fine point Sharpie to mark the part. Now we want to mark in the crevice that goes all the way around the part including this ledge here at the back. I'm definitely using magnification for this process. Fun little fact here. Note that this is not a straight line. That is a curved line, and that's because this fairing needs to fit around the outside circumference of the lower airframe tube. Now I've got a fresh number 11 blade, and I'm going to score the line all the way around that. Remember, you don't need to cut all the way through the plastic. Having said that, be aware that the vacuforming process does stretch the plastic out and make it thinner. There's the possibility that the knife might go through some portions of the plastic, especially on these long edges. Now we'll break the score line. It might be helpful to go and run the knife along some of those lines again. Looks great. We'll do that 3 more times. The next item on our to-do list will be to free up this opening or window through which the fin will eventually fit. Now we're going to start by doing something a little bit unusual here. I've made a tiny mark right at the very forward end of this. And I am going to use a 1/32 inch drill bit to drill a hole right at that spot. It shouldn't take more than 2 or 3 twists of the drill. We're then going to mark the insides of the window and then we're going to cut along those lines. Now, cut if you can just to the inside of those lines. The reason for that, it's a lot easier to sand or cut or file or do something to make the opening larger because it's impossible to make the opening smaller. Take this all the way up to the drill mark we made. You will need to use multiple strokes for this, as we can't use our bend and flex trick. It's impossible with all of this on the inside. So multiple passes. And there, our hole is open. Now we'll need to do some work on it, but eventually the fin will fit through that. We'll do that 3 more times. We'll continue prepping the fairings by sanding the sides and gently enlarging the hole for the fin. But before we do that, we're going to trim back the plastic on the base so that it's flush with the reinforcement piece that we glued in. This may not show up well on camera, but this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to place this flat on the workbench and then drag the blade against the reinforcement several times. And eventually we'll get a sliver of plastic out of there. Next we'll take a wine cork with some sandpaper wrapped around it and refine that edge a bit. I'd also like to use a sanding stick to sand the base of the fairing as flat as possible. Don't overdo this. This plastic is very thin and we don't want to go through the plastic. That should do it. I'll complete that on the other three. Before we proceed much more, let's do some cleanup here. The Sharpie marks that are left over from the cutting phase are starting to bug me, so let's clean those up. I have some standard rubbing alcohol here and a Q-tip. You can just gently rub those markings off. When they get a little wet, just wipe off the excess with a paper towel. Let's do the other side. Now there's another reason we want to do this. When it comes time to paint the model, these dark marks will take a lot of paint to cover up. So let's go ahead and get rid of them now. Before we start sanding things down and doing anything irreversible, let's talk about how the fairing is supposed to sit on the airframe tube. The back edge of the fairing should be aligned with the back edge of the airframe tube. And we center that over this gap in the corrugations. It sits on top of the corrugations. It does not fit down into the corrugations. That's an important distinction to make. And we can see right here that it would be really helpful if we had some sort of mark on the airframe tube out here in front as a center line, if you will. Well, I've measured this already, and that gap between the corrugations here at the front is just a hair over 1/2 inch. So if we put a ruler between the corrugations there and line it up, we can find the midpoint between the corrugations and mark it. We can then extend that mark forward, which will give us a very valuable reference line for mounting the fairings onto the airframe tube. We'll repeat that 4 times around the tube. Let's start shaping the sides of our fairing. Now I'm using a sanding stick, but I need to caution you, resist the urge to use the full length of the sanding stick. Instead, sand in small sections. The reason for that is that this is not a straight line that we're sanding. It has to conform with the curvature of the airframe tube. So it's best to take out any irregularities in just short little bits. I also have the airframe tube close at hand, so I can check the fit on a regular basis. We're lining up the back edge of the fairing with the back edge of the airframe tube and centering the tip on the mark we just made. We are getting very, very close on this side, and this one, before we even start, is already looking pretty good. Let's keep sanding. That looks like a really good fit. Let's start working on the hole for the fin. I'm using an emery board for most of this. and I'm working in sections. Another great tool to have is a flat file. I've got this flat file that we can use to clean up the bottom of the slot. A few strokes of a file will do a great deal on this very thin plastic. Let's bring in a fin just to see how far apart we are. We've still got a long way to go. About 10 millimeters of the fin is not in the right position yet. So we've got to make this significantly wider. Let's work on the upper section a little bit. I can also bring in a fresh blade and take off tiny little slivers of plastic. That's especially helpful up here towards the tip. We are getting closer, but we still have quite a ways to go. I'm going to take a little plastic away from the bottom edge here. We'll bring our file back in to refine the fit at the base of the slot. Getting a little closer each time. This is very much a game of trial and error. Believe it or not, we're getting closer. We are almost there. We need to take some pressure off this bottom edge and extend the top just a little bit. I'm going to widen the top just a hair. Okay, the tight part is right here. Let's see how that fits against the airframe. Almost there. Still a little tight right here on the sides and just a little bit more at the tip. Going to take a hair off of the bottom. Now just a touch more at the top. You can see how this is an iterative process, just a little bit at a time with lots of minor corrections. One more adjustment at the top and I think we're golden. Let's bring in this alignment guide. And that is a magnificent fit. I'm very pleased with that. Now I'm going to mark these with numbers so that the fin and the fairing stay matched with each other. We'll finish the other 3 fin and fairing sets off camera. We'll be using a different adhesive for this step of our project. This is old school plastic model cement. It works a whole lot like the liquid cement we've used up to this point. It just works a little slower. It's a thicker material. It welds the plastic together much like the liquid cement works. It just slows down the process a little bit. We'll apply some of this to the root edge of our fin, position it about 1/2 inch forward of the aft end of the airframe tube, drop our fairing over that without gluing the fairing in place. That's an important distinction to make. Line everything up, check alignment with our alignment guide, and then tape everything down, the forward and aft edges of our fairing, until everything dries. Let's give it a shot. I've got a paper towel here. Sometimes the adhesive gets a little stringy. I'm also wearing magnification. I'm running a bead of this along all the surfaces on the root edge of the fin. It is stinky. I'll position that in place. Again, that's about 10 to 12 millimeters forward of the aft end of the tube. I'm going to drop the fairing over that, taking care not to get any adhesive on it. Adjust the fit of everything. Check the fit with the alignment guide. And then I have a couple of pieces of tape ready. One of them will go here at the aft end. The other will go at the forward end. I need to emphasize again, we're not gluing the fairing in place. We're simply using it as an alignment guide at this point. With everything in place, we'll allow this to cure for at least an hour. The fairings are simply taped on at this point, but the glue holding the fins in place has already dried. We're at the point on this particular project where we need some type of holding fixture for our model. I just cut this out of an Amazon box and put some bubble wrap in the cradles to hold the model. This will keep the fins up off the workbench. There is one minor detail that bugs me a little bit here. Let's take a look at it. I'm going to peel the tape holding the forward end of one of the fairings in place. And I want you to notice this gap right here. There is a definite space between the fairing and the body tube just ahead of the forward edge of this wrap. I've done some homework already, and a piece of 020 styrene will fit perfectly in that gap. So what I'd like to do is trim some tiny pieces of this styrene scrap, set it in place, glue it to the underside of each fairing at this point, then remove the fairings and trim the styrene. I've got a tiny scrap of styrene here. What we'd like to do is fit it in place under the forward edge of that fairing wrap and then tack it in place with some thin plastic cement. I'll hold that in place for a moment. I'm then going to release the tape at the aft end of the fairing that's holding the fairing in place. And lift this off and do the same thing for the other 3 fins. We now have 4 fairings with these odd little bits of plastic on the front. What are we going to do next? Well, we're going to trim away the excess. I'll use a fresh blade, and I am using magnification. I'll use the score and snap method to get the big chunks off. And eventually we'll start nibbling all of the excess off. Finally, we'll bring in a sanding stick and do a final gentle shaping. We'll repeat that 3 more times. We've installed these styrene spacer bits onto each of the fin fairings and cleaned them up with a sanding stick. Next, let's see how they fit onto the model. That fit is absolutely perfect. We're ready to install the fin fairings. Let's talk through the process of installing our first fin fairing. We're going to use 2 different types of adhesive for this step. First, we're going to use the tube type cement on the aft edge of the fairing that will fit onto the back edge of the airframe tube. At the forward end, we're going to use a couple of drops of the liquid cement, the Tamiya Extra Thin. Once those are in place, we'll position this in there. We'll hold it down so that the Tamiya Extra Thin can grab hold of the airframe tube up here at the front. Keep in mind that the Tamiya Extra Thin will adhere to the primer. At the back edge, we're going to provide a little bit of pressure until that glue sets up. We'll then tape that in at the aft edge. It shouldn't be necessary to tape the front edge at all. We will not apply any glue to the sides or the fin joint at this point. We're going to come back and do that later after all 4 fin fairings have initially been installed. Note that we're only applying the adhesive to the very tip of the fairing and the very aft end of the fairing. We'll focus on the sides later. We'll take a piece of tape and tape the back edge. All 4 fin fairings are in place. We'll just let that adhesive settle down for a couple of hours. Let's take a look at this photograph of the Saturn V on display at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. This particular first stage was intended to be used on the Apollo 18 mission. That mission was canceled and it became available for museum use at that point. In particular, take a look at the border between the fairing and the surface of the first stage, and notice that there's a gap there. That's actually pretty reliably reproduced on our model, which means we won't have to spend a great deal of time filling that with any putty or other type of filler. All we'll need to do is apply some thin cement to the points where the fairing contacts the corrugations underneath. I'm going to apply the liquid cement using this nasty old paintbrush that I've used for this task for 20 years or more. I am using magnification, and I'm using the adhesive very sparingly. It's possible to even work the brush in between the fairing and the corrugations. I'll put some additional adhesive down here at the tail end of the fairing. And we will repeat that for the rest of the seams. We also need to apply some thin cement to the 8 fin fairing joints. Our next task will be to cut out these trapezoidal bits between the fin fairings and below the corrugations. Now the kit directions would simply have us trim up to the spacer ring inside the tube. The problem with that is that it would cut well into the corrugations up here, and we don't want to do that. Instead, we're going to trim to an arbitrary point below the corrugations. about 6/10 of an inch or 15 millimeters. To help guide these cuts, we're going to create some 15 millimeter wide masking tape. Now this is standard 18 millimeter tape. I'm going to just verify that it is indeed straight. It is. And then I'm going to create a mark at each end at 15 millimeters wide. We'll connect those two marks. Run a knife down, and there's our 15 millimeter tape. We'll take a section of the 15 millimeter tape and line it up with the aft end of the airframe tube. This will give us a line against which we can draw our knife blade. The first bit has been freed. We'll need to clean that up with some sanding sticks. We'll repeat this 3 more times. And with that, the aft section of our Saturn V is complete. In our next episode, we'll be installing the cable raceway details onto the airframe tubes. Thanks for watching.